January 1946, Washington, D.C. The city is under occupation. Imperial Japanese Army sentries, bayonets fixed, stand at the Lincoln Memorial. The click of their boots on the pavement is the only sound. From the US Capitol, the rising sun flag snaps in the winter wind. In Times Square, Imperial Marines patrol streets papered over with Japanese propaganda. This is the nightmare scenario, an America defeated. Yes, we understand that this scenario, a full-scale occupation of the continental United States, was something most people, even the Japanese themselves, didn't think possible. But this isn't a video about how Japan could have won. We're not exploring alternate history or military strategy. This video is about a question. If Japan had won, what would their occupation of America have looked like? What would it have felt like? To answer that question, we don't even need to speculate. We only need to look at the documented 3-year nightmare endured by the thousands of civilians who lived under this exact system, starting in December 1941. The chilling plan for America wasn't a plan, it was a practice, and its testing ground was Manila. Our story begins in Manila in late 1941. Before the war, it was known as the Pearl of the Orient. It was a cosmopolitan, tropical capital, a blend of Spanish colonial history and American modernity. For the roughly 8,000 American expats living there, life was good. They lived in exclusive neighborhoods, attended polo matches, and were protected by a major US military presence at Clark Field and Kempeitai. They believed they were safe. The war in Europe was half a world away. But on December 8th, 1941, just 10 hours after Pearl Harbor, that illusion was shattered. Japanese bombers struck Clark Field, wiping out America's air power in the Pacific in a single afternoon. The invasion of the Philippines had begun. In the weeks that followed, the Japanese advanced and the American military was routed. To spare the city from destruction, General Douglas MacArthur declared Manila an open city and retreated his forces to Bataan and Corregidor. On January 2nd, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army entered Manila. For the 8,000 American civilians left behind, the occupation was immediate. The Japanese command posted proclamations across the city. All enemy nationals were to remain in their homes, pending further instructions. The Kempeitai, or Japanese secret police, began their work, and a new, suffocating fear settled over the city. The Americans in Manila, who had considered themselves residents, were about to be reclassified as prisoners. The hammer fell just days later. The Japanese military administration posted new orders across Manila. All enemy nationals were to report immediately to designated assembly points. This order included Americans, British, Dutch, and any other citizen of a nation at war with Japan. Thousands of civilians, who just weeks before had been running businesses and attending parties, were now officially classified as enemies. Panic and confusion swept through the American community. They were allowed to bring only what they could carry, often one small bag. As one internee recorded on January 8, 1942, we were allowed one handbag per person and mats to sleep on. Diaries from those first days describe frantic panicking, families arguing and weeping, trying to distill a lifetime into one bag. Another internee recalled, "The next day, an order came to be ready in half hour with one suitcase." Then came the march. thousands of American civilians, carrying their meager belongings, walked through the streets of Manila under the gaze of armed Japanese soldiers. They were marched to collection points, like the Rizal Memorial Stadium, one of several designated registration/assembly sites used by the occupation authorities. From there, they were loaded into trucks. They had no idea where they were going. They only knew that they were prisoners. The trucks rumbled through the city and stopped at a walled compound in the heart of Manila. The gates were opened and the prisoners were forced inside. They were standing on the campus of the University of Santo Tomás. The Japanese intended to run the University of Santo Tomás as cheaply as possible. After its conversion to a prison, guards were posted at the perimeter gates, and they only had one job: to keep the enemy nationals in. For everything else, the internees were on their own. As one wartime account put it flatly, the Japanese made no provision for feeding their prisoners. The first shock was the overcrowding. The campus, designed for a few thousand students, was now the permanent home for nearly 4,000 American and Allied civilians. Families were crammed into classrooms, 20 or 30 to a room, sleeping on the hard concrete floors. The living quarters in the building became more and more crowded. The Japanese allowed some of the men to build shacks on the ground to use them, using anything they could find. In a desperate attempt to create order, the prisoners formed an internee committee. They organized their own sanitation details, food committees, and even a camp hospital. They naively believed that if they were organized and compliant, the Japanese would leave them alone. But the most pressing crisis was space. There wasn't any. The internees began to build their own city within the city. A shanty town of homemade shacks built from scrap wood, bamboo, and woven mats grew across the university's once pristine lawns. These shacks became the symbol of the camp, a desperate, fragile attempt to maintain the basic unit of the family in a system designed to break it. In these early months, the internees still had money. They could buy extra food from a camp market, and their Filipino friends would sometimes pass packages through the fence. In the early days of the camp, Filipino citizens often gave food to internees through the bars of the gate, one account remembers, before the guards tightened the wire and searches. There was a sense that the internment would be short-lived, that the war was a temporary disruption and MacArthur would soon return. American civilian Margaret Sams summed up that early bravado. Americans couldn't be taken over by the Japanese, no matter how many of them there were and how few of us there were. This hope, like the shantytown shacks, would not last. The Japanese military administration had no intention of leaving them alone. It was simply biding its time. The civilian internees were not the only Americans trapped in Santo Tomás. In May 1942, a new group of prisoners arrived, and they weren't civilians. They were 77 US Army and Navy nurses captured after the fall of Bataan and Corregidor. They became known as the Angels of Bataan and Corregidor. These women were military personnel. They had endured the hellish frontline conditions of the Bataan siege, treating wounded soldiers in open-air jungle hospitals while under constant bombardment. When Bataan fell, they were evacuated to the Malinta Tunnel on Corregidor, where they continued to work as the island was pulverized by Japanese artillery. They were not enemy nationals, they were prisoners of war. Their arrival at Santo Tomás marked a new phase. The Japanese ordered them to set up and run the camp hospital. For the next 3 years, these 77 nurses became the expert witnesses to the camp's systemic decline. They were the ones who had to treat the rampant beriberi, dysentery, and pellagra with almost no medicine. They were the ones who had to watch their fellow Americans, their patients, and their colleagues waste away from starvation. The relative order of the first year in Santo Tomás was a cruel illusion. It wasn't a community, it was a holding pen. And soon, the Japanese military administration began to tighten its grip. The internee committee was stripped of its authority. The camp market was shut down. The Japanese military took direct control of the food supply, and the rations were immediately and drastically cut. This is the central, documented reality of the internment. Systematic, engineered starvation. Internee diaries from this period are a horrifying logbook of decline. The daily ration was reduced to a scoop of watery, molding cornmeal mush, or lugao. That was it. Adults, once strong, active businessmen and professionals, saw their weight plummet by 50, 60, or 70 pounds. This wasn't just hunger, it was the complete medical breakdown of the human body. The camp was consumed by diseases of malnutrition. Beriberi, caused by a lack of thiamine, became rampant, causing bodies to swell with fluid and hearts to fail. Pellagra, a niacin deficiency, caused agonizing skin lesions and dementia. Dysentery, spread by the collapsed sanitation, was a death sentence for the weak. A death watch was organized by the internees. Its only job was to sit with the dying, who were often too numerous for the camp's small hospital ward. This was not an accident of war. It was a clear demonstration of the proper place for bestial devils. In a system built on racial hierarchy, the enemy nationals were at the very bottom. They were a population to be managed, controlled, and ultimately, through deliberate neglect, eliminated. The passive, grinding horror of starvation was enforced by the active, sharp terror of the Kempeitai. While the regular Japanese soldiers manned the gates, the Kempeitai, the military secret police, handled internal security. They were the unseen masters of the camp, a force that operated with total impunity. The Kempeitai ran a network of informants inside the internee population. They cultivated collaborators, rewarding them with extra food or privileges in exchange for information. This system was designed to destroy trust, turning the camp into a paranoid state where a casual complaint to a friend could be a death sentence. Any internee suspected of resistance, of possessing a radio, communicating with the outside, or planning an escape was not questioned by the camp administration, they were taken by the Kempeitai. The records of their methods are clear. They used beatings, waterboarding, and electrocution as standard tools of interrogation. Internees who were taken away for questioning would often be returned weeks later, broken and mutilated, or they wouldn't be returned at all. This was the second half of the control mechanism. Starvation was the blunt instrument to weaken the population, and the Kempeitai was the scalpel used to surgically remove any spark of hope or resistance. The starvation at Santo Tomás and the Kempeitai torture was not random cruelty. It was the logical, practical application of a state-sponsored theology. To understand the why, we have to look at the ideology Japan had built for itself. Japanese wartime discourse officially cast Americans and the British as subhuman. The term was Kichiku Bae, bestial American/British devils. This wasn't battlefield slang, it was an official ideology of dehumanization repeated in media and propaganda. As historian John Dower documented in his foundational work, A War Without Mercy, The Japanese defined themselves as the Yamato Minzoku, the Yamato race. They were the leading race, divinely ordained to lead all others. They saw themselves as pure, both morally and spiritually, a status that placed them at the top of a new global hierarchy. In this new world order, every race had a proper place. Americans and the British, as the primary enemy, were cast as the ultimate other. They were the demonic, polluting force. In Japanese propaganda, Westerners were portrayed as monsters, ogres, and devils. This racial framing is what connects the actions of the camp guards to the ideology of the state. It's the psychological tool that makes systematic brutality possible. When you've defined your prisoners as bestial devils, feeding them is a waste of resources. Torturing them for information is not a crime. It's an interrogation of an animal. Letting them die of beriberi and dysentery isn't neglect, it's a holy war of purification. The suffering in Santo Tomás was the Yamato Minzoku putting the bestial Americans in their proper place. Santo Tomás wasn't the only camp. 40 miles south of Manila, the Japanese ran another major internment camp at Los Baños, a former agricultural college. It held over 2,100 civilians. As the war progressed, its conditions became just as horrific as Santo Tomás. The internees, including hundreds of American families, were slowly starving to death. By early 1945, the camp commandant had posted a death roster and was preparing to execute the remaining prisoners. The US military, having retaken Manila, learned of this. On February 23, 1945, the 11th Airborne Division launched one of the most daring rescue missions of the entire war. In a perfectly coordinated land and air assault, paratroopers dropped from the sky while amphibious tractors crossed the nearby lake. The liberators hit the camp with total surprise. The GIs who stormed the camp weren't prepared for what they found. They found 2,100 living skeletons. The internees were dazed, emaciated, and suffering from the severe malnutrition and diseases we've described. One paratrooper, remembering the rescue, said the prisoners were walking dead. Another described them as just bones, with skin stretched over them. The rescuers, many in tears, carried the skeletal internees, who weighed as little as 70 pounds, to the amphibious tractors. They set fire to the camp and, in a running gun battle with Japanese guard units, evacuated all 2,100 prisoners to safety without a single internee casualty. The liberation of Los Baños and Santo Tomás wasn't just a rescue. It was the first time the American public saw, in graphic, undeniable detail, exactly what the Japanese occupation had done to its own citizens. The liberation of the camps was a story of hope, but it was happening at the exact same time as a story of unimaginable horror. The Battle of Manila was raging. While the 11th Airborne rescued the prisoners at Los Baños, the main body of US forces was fighting to retake the capital. The Japanese commander, General Yamashita, had ordered his troops to abandon the city to spare it from destruction. Rear Admiral Iwabuchi Sanji, commander of the Japanese naval forces in the city, defied that order. He and his 16,000 troops dug in, vowing to fight to the death and destroy the city. But they didn't just fight the American soldiers, they turned their full, unrestrained fury on the civilian population of Manila. What happened next wasn't a crossfire or collateral damage, it was a systematic door-to-door extermination. For 3 weeks, as the battle raged, Iwabuchi's cornered forces enacted a genocidal slaughter. They bayoneted infants, they rounded up families, locked them in buildings, and set them on fire. They systematically raped and mutilated thousands of women. They used grenades to massacre civilians huddled in churches and hospitals. By the time the battle was over, an estimated 100,000 Filipino civilians were dead. This was the Sangko Sakusin, the 3-alls policy of kill all, burn all, loot all, applied to an urban center. This is the final documented piece of the puzzle. It's the answer to the question, what would happen if an American city resisted? The Manila Massacre is the ultimate horrific expression of the Kichiku Abaye ideology. When the bestial devils could no longer be controlled, they would simply be exterminated. A reality of mass executions, reprisals, and extermination campaigns like the 3-alls policy is difficult to comprehend. We're not the first to explore this dark territory. The idea of an America defeated by the Axis has haunted our culture for decades precisely because the blueprint for it was so clearly drawn. This scenario is the foundation of Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle. His novel imagined a United States carved into a Japanese Pacific States and a greater Nazi Reich. While it's a work of science fiction, its core power is its exploration of the psychological and cultural weight of submission. A world where Americans are forced to adopt the ideology of their masters. It's the premise of Harry Turtledove's Days of Infamy series, which imagined a successful Japanese invasion and a brutal multi-year occupation of Hawaii. This fictional scenario directly mirrors the real-world Eastern Operation, the abandoned Japanese plan to seize Hawaii after Pearl Harbor. Other military-focused anthologies, like Peter Tsuras's Rising Sun Victorious, explore the specific what-if divergences, the single point of failures that could have led to this outcome. The scenario we've outlined, a nation subjugated by a military government, its leadership eliminated in camps, is chilling, but it's not fantasy. Imperial Japan never had the industrial capacity or logistical reach to successfully conquer the continental United States. That part of our scenario is pure speculation, but the consequences of that scenario are not. The occupation playbook was consistent, brutal, and thoroughly documented. The systems of racial hierarchy, military governments, and civilian internment were not hypothetical. They were the reality for millions in China, Malaya, and the Philippines. Americans weren't just a potential target of this system. In the internment camps of Santo Tomás and Los Baños, they were its victims. The chilling plan for America wasn't a plan at all. It was a practice, and for thousands of Americans, the what if was their daily reality for 3 long and agonizing years. But what do you think? Do you think our take here is far-fetched? Do you think that somehow a victorious Japan would be less brutal? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.